The moment Julia Norris stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the red dust of the plains swirled around her skirts like the town itself was trying to warn her away, and she squared her jaw and walked straight into it anyway. She had not come all the way from St. Louis with 2 carpetbags and a broken heart to be deterred by a little dust. She had come because her father's ranch, the Norris spread, 300 acres of grazing land and creek-fed pasture outside of Redemption Creek, had been left to her following his death 6 months prior, and nobody, not a single soul in this blistering town, had expected a woman to show up and claim it. She could see that much in the way the men on the porch of the general store stopped talking when she passed. She could see it in the way the sheriff, a thick-necked man named Beaumont who smelled of pipe tobacco and entitlement, came down the wooden steps of his office to meet her with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Norris," he said, tipping his hat only slightly. "We weren't expecting a woman." "Clearly," Julia replied, and walked past him toward the livery stable to arrange for a horse. She was 24 years old, with dark copper hair that she kept pinned up in the heat and green eyes that tended to make people uncomfortable when she held their gaze too long. She was not a woman given to tears, though she had shed more than her share of them in the months since her father's letter arrived, not the letter announcing his death, but the earlier one, the one he had written only weeks before it, telling her that there were men in Redemption Creek who wanted the Norris land and would not wait politely for him to decide what to do about it. He had been right about that. He had died before he could do anything about it at all. The man who ran the livery stable was named Hector, a lean older man with a white mustache and kind eyes who shook her hand properly and did not make her feel like an oddity. He told her that her father's ranch had been looked after, more or less, by a cowboy who had worked for the old man for 3 years and had continued showing up to do the work even after the wages stopped coming because there was nobody left to pay them. "Who is he?" Julia asked, adjusting her gloves. Hector squinted. "George Maddox, good man, quiet, worked cattle most of his adult life. Your father trusted him more than he trusted most people, and Edmund Norris was not a man who trusted easily." Julia thought about that on the 4-mile ride out to the ranch, atop a speckled gray mare Hector lent her. The land was beautiful in the brutal way of West Texas, wide and wild and baked golden by a sun that seemed twice the size it had been in Missouri. The creek she had heard so much about wound through the property like a silver thread, bordered by cottonwood trees whose pale leaves shivered in the warm wind. She crossed it on a low wooden bridge her father had built himself, and there ahead of her was the house, modest, solid, built from cedar and determination. And beside the split-rail fence, working a young horse on a long lunge line with slow, deliberate patience, was a man she had never seen before. George Maddox was tall and lean in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn chambray shirt and brown eyes that, when he turned and saw her riding toward him, registered genuine surprise before settling into something more measured. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and a way of standing very still that made her think of the cottonwood trees rather than the men on the porch in town. He was perhaps 29 or 30, she guessed. He had the kind of face that would age slowly because it was already weathered in all the right ways. He let the horse settle and walked to the fence as she dismounted. "Miss Norris," he said, and his voice was low and even without the performative ease of a man trying to impress anyone. "I'm George Maddox. I worked for your father." "I know," she said. "Hector told me. I understand you've been keeping this place running without pay." A muscle moved in his jaw. Your father was a fair man. Seemed wrong to let it fall apart. Julia looked at him for a moment, taking full stock of the man. There was nothing calculating about his expression, nothing that wanted something from her. She had encountered very few people in her life whom she could say that about, and she found it notable. "I intend to pay you everything you're owed," she said, "and I'd like you to stay on if you're willing." He considered her the same way she had considered him, openly and without apology. "Can you run a cattle ranch?" he asked. There was no condescension in it. It was a plain question. "I can learn," she said. "My father raised me to know the basics, and I have enough sense to listen to people who know more than I do." Something shifted in his expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." The first week was an education in how thoroughly someone could underestimate their own ignorance. Julia had thought herself reasonably prepared. She was wrong. The ranch kept 43 head of cattle and 6 horses, and the sheer daily labor of it, the feeding, the fence mending, the water management, the constant vigilance against the encroaching dry season was staggering. George never made her feel stupid for not knowing something, but he also never softened the reality of the work to make her feel better. He simply showed her what needed doing, explained why, and then got on with it. She kept up because she refused not to, and he seemed to note that without comment. They developed a rhythm inside that first week that felt older than its days, a kind of efficient partnership built on mutual respect and very little small talk. In the evenings, Julia cooked plainly but adequately, and George ate at the worktable near the window rather than inside, until the fourth night when a sudden thunderstorm drove him to knock on the door and ask, without apparent self-consciousness, whether there was coffee to spare. She waved him inside, and he sat across from her at the small kitchen table, and they talked for 2 hours about everything except feelings. He told her about the cattle market, about the threat of drought, about the fact that a man named Harlan Croft owned the neighboring property to the west, and had been making increasingly aggressive overtures toward the Norris land even while her father was still alive. He told her this the way he told her everything, directly, without decoration, as though she deserved to know the truth and would be able to handle it. "How aggressive?" she asked. "He tried to move his fence line 3 times last year. Your father moved it back each time. 2 of your father's fence posts were cut last winter. Might have been Croft's men, might not have been. He wrapped both hands around his tin cup. Croft made an offer on this property the day after your father's funeral. Before the body was in the ground 12 hours. Julia stared at the surface of her coffee. The anger that moved through her was cold and clarifying rather than hot. "Did he?" she said. "He'll make it again, to you. He'll try to make you feel like keeping the land is foolish, like it's too much for a woman alone." She raised her eyes. "I'm not alone." George held her gaze and nodded once. "No, you're not." The moment was brief and neither of them drew attention to it, but it settled into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Harlan Croft appeared on a Tuesday morning, riding a fine black horse and attended by 2 of his ranch hands, who waited at the property line while he came ahead alone, hat in hand, wearing a smile that had been calculated to charm. He was a man of perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, with silver at his temples and the kind of easy confidence that came from decades of getting what he wanted. He complimented the property. He expressed sympathy about her father. He made his offer in the 3rd sentence, dressed up in so much neighborly language that someone less attentive might have missed it. Julia did not miss it. "Mr. Croft," she said pleasantly, "I appreciate the visit. I'm not selling. If your fence line moves 1 inch closer to my property, I'll have the sheriff out here to document it. And if the sheriff proves unwilling, I'll go over his head to the county seat in Abilene." She held his gaze with those green eyes that made people uncomfortable. "Is there anything else?" Croft's smile thinned but held. He replaced his hat. "You're a determined woman, Miss Norris." "I am," she agreed. George had been working the near pasture fence during that exchange and had watched without intervening. When Croft rode away, George walked back toward the house, stopping near where she stood. He studied her face for a moment. "You all right?" "Perfectly," she said, and meant it. "Though I suspect we haven't heard the last of him." George tilted his head, a gesture she was beginning to learn meant agreement. Not by a long way. She was right. In the weeks that followed, things began to go wrong in small, deniable ways. A section of fence along the western border was found cut, and 3 young steers were missing, presumably having wandered onto Croft's property. When she rode to inquire with George at her side, Croft's foreman claimed the animals had never arrived and invited her to search the property, a gesture so theatrical in its confidence that she knew immediately the cattle had already been moved or altered. Then a section of the creek feed irrigation channel that watered the south pasture was blocked with debris in a fashion that did not look natural. Then one of the good mares came up lame in a way that the farrier, when he came out from town, found suspicious. Each time, Julia documented the damage and continued. Each time, she and George worked in the long hours after supper to repair what had been broken. She was aware in those evenings of how much she had come to rely on the steady presence of this man, not as a crutch, but as a compass. He was always exactly where the situation required him to be, doing exactly what the situation required, without drama or complaint. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, noting the way he moved careful and deliberate, and utterly without pretense and thinking thoughts that she quickly directed back toward practical matters. George, for his part, was quieter than usual during those weeks. He was thinking. She would later understand. He was working through something internal that he did not yet have the words for, or perhaps had the words and did not yet trust them. The evening that changed things between them arrived on a night in late April when the sky was doing something spectacular, piled high with thunderheads lit orange and gold by the setting sun, the air smelling of rain that was still hours away. Julia had brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch steps where George was sitting, cleaning the bridle he used on the roan gelding. She sat beside him, not at a careful distance but close, because the porch was small and because she had stopped worrying some time ago about what it might mean. They sat in silence for a while, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate deeply. He was not a man who felt compelled to fill silence. Most men she had known were frightened of it. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked up. "You can ask. Why did you stay after my father died before you knew I was coming? You had no obligation. You could have hired on anywhere." He was quiet for a time, turning the bridle in his hands. "Your father told me about you," he said finally. "In the last few months when things with Croft were getting worse, he talked about you a fair amount." A pause. "He said you were the most stubborn, capable person he had ever raised, and that he should have sent for you years ago instead of trying to manage alone." Julia felt something ache in her chest. "He never said that to me." "Men of that generation often don't," George said. "But he said it, and I guess I wanted to make sure there was something worth coming back to if you came." He turned the bridle once more and then looked at her directly, and it was the most unguarded she had seen his expression. "I'm glad you came." The words were simple and plainly delivered, and they hit her somewhere behind her ribs with a force she had not anticipated. She looked away at the golden clouds because looking at his face right then seemed like too much. "I'm glad I came too," she said, "though I suspect I might have come sooner if I'd known what was waiting." She had not meant it to come out quite the way it did. A beat of silence stretched between them, weighted and warm, and she heard him set the bridle down carefully on the step beside him. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used only her given name, and the way he said it was very different from any other word he had said to her. She turned back. He was looking at her with that same unguarded expression, and she realized that the man who was so carefully measured in everything, in his work, in his words, in the way he held himself, was currently not measured at all. He was just looking at her, fully and without protection. "I'm not a man with much," he said. "I don't own land. I don't have prospects that would make a banker happy. I have a horse and a saddle and about 12 years of knowing cattle." He paused. "But I think about you considerably more than is probably professional," and it seemed like the honest thing to say. Julia stared at him for a moment that felt very long. Then, because she was not a woman given to indirection, she leaned forward and kissed him once, briefly and deliberately, and pulled back. He blinked. "Considerably more than professional," she said, "is exactly how I think about you." The smile that broke across his face then was the kind that seemed like it surprised him, too wide and too real for the careful man she had come to know, and she discovered that she wanted to be responsible for that expression as frequently as possible for as long as possible. They did not make declarations that night. They were both people who required time to understand their own hearts, and they were both acutely aware that the ranch was in precarious circumstances that required clear heads. But something had shifted in the air between them, something that had been building since the day she rode up and found him lunging that young horse with all that patient concentration, and it did not unshift. In the days that followed, they continued working harder than ever, because Croft's interference had not ceased, but the atmosphere between them was different in a way that had no single word. George brought her wildflowers once, a handful of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets pulled from the creek bank, and presented them with such a matter-of-fact expression, as though it were simply a thing to be done, that she laughed before she could stop herself. He looked briefly startled and then laughed too, a low sound she had not heard from him before, and she filed it carefully in her memory alongside his rare, too-wide smile. He rode into town with her one Saturday in early May when she needed supplies and to speak with a lawyer about the property documentation, wanting to get her ownership properly formalized at the county level after a remark from Croft's foreman had suggested they might dispute her title. The lawyer, a thin, careful man named Aldridge who practiced out of a small office above the millinery, was helpful and thorough, and assured her that her father's will was clean and her claim sound. He also very quietly told her that Croft had been to see him as well 6 weeks prior, inquiring about the legal mechanisms by which an abandoned property could revert to adjacent owners. The word abandoned had been used specifically. Julia kept her voice very even. "And what did you tell him?" Aldridge adjusted his spectacles. "That the property was not abandoned merely between owners, and that the heir was expected." He glanced at his papers. "I confess I was not certain the heir would actually appear. I have a way of defying expectations," she said pleasantly. After they left Aldridge's office, she and George stood together in the sunlit street outside the millinery for a moment. She told him what Aldridge had said about Croft's inquiry, and she watched a quiet anger move through George's expression like a cloud crossing the sun there and then controlled, deliberately set aside. "He was building a legal argument before you even arrived," George said. "Yes. We need to register the deed at the county courthouse in Abilene, in person with documentation and soon." "I know," she glanced at him. "I was thinking you might come with me." He looked at her steadily. "Of course." They made the trip to Abilene 3 days later, riding the 40 miles on horseback over 2 days, with a camp beside the road on the open plain between. Julia had thought she might find the sleeping outdoors difficult. She was a city woman by the last several years, whatever her origins, but the truth was she slept deeply, wrapped in a bedroll near a small fire with the vast Texas sky wheeling overhead, and she woke to the sound of George moving about already, heating coffee and seeing to the horses, and she thought that she could not remember feeling more at home in a place than she did in this landscape she barely knew. Abilene was a proper cattle town, loud and busy, smelling of livestock and wood smoke and commerce. They registered the deed without incident at the Taylor County Courthouse, a formal and very final-feeling process that left Julia with a certified copy of the title that she folded and placed inside her jacket, against her chest, as though it were a letter she intended to read again on the ride home. On the second day of the return trip, when they made camp again beside a wide, shallow section of a creek she did not know the name of, George built the fire and she cooked the simple trail meal she had packed. And after they ate, they sat beside the low flames and the conversation moved into territory they had not yet mapped together. He told her about his childhood, a ranch in New Mexico territory, a father who worked horses, a mother who died of fever when he was 11, and left him and his younger brother in the care of a father who was a good man but not a communicative one. He had hired on to his first cattle drive at 17. He had worked his way east through a string of ranches until he arrived at her father's property 3 years ago and stayed because Edmund Norris was, he said, the first employer who had ever spoken to him as an equal. He was a complicated man, Julia said quietly, staring at the fire. He was not always easy, but he was honest, and that's rarer than people acknowledge. It is, George agreed. She looked at him across the fire. The light was amber on his face, and the night was warm, and the stars were the kind of impossible density you could not see from any city. "Tell me something you want," she said. "Not about the ranch, something you want for yourself." He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might deflect, but he didn't. "Land," he said at last. "Not a great empire of it, just a piece of ground that's mine. Somewhere I've put in work and can see the results of it. A place where I can point to a fence and say, I built that, and a pasture and say, I brought that in from scrub." He paused. "And people. I want there to be people in the house." The way he said it simply, without any dramatics, as though it were the most natural confession in the world, undid something in her that had been held together for a long time. She swallowed. "That doesn't sound like too much to want," she said. He shook his head once. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She crossed the few feet of space between them and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. And after a moment his arm came around her with the same unhurried certainty he brought to every other thing he did, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the fire while the Texas night settled around them, enormous and quiet and full of stars. "I'm not selling that ranch," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither am I." She lifted her head and looked at him, studying the particular warmth in his brown eyes. "Is that what this is becoming, ours?" "I'd like it to be," he said. "If you'd have me." "George Maddox," she said, "I have been having you since the second day, when you showed me how to mend a fence post without making me feel ignorant for not knowing. I was simply waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, that low, real sound, and then he kissed her, not briefly this time but properly, with both hands framing her face and the firelight warm on them both. And it was exactly what a first real kiss should be. Unhurried, certain, and full of the specific gravity of two people who had recognized each other. The return to Redemption Creek brought them back to the work and the problem of Croft, which had not resolved itself in their absence. On their second day back, George discovered that the entire northern fence line, a quarter-mile of it, had been pulled out of the ground, and the posts stacked in a heap. It was a message more than an act of practical vandalism. The posts could be re-driven, but it required 2 days of hard labor, and someone wanted her to feel the futility of continual repair. Julia rode into town to see the sheriff. Beaumont received her in his office with that same smile that lived only on the surface of his face. He listened to her account of the fence destruction, nodded at appropriate intervals, and explained that without witnesses he could not assign blame. He said the word neighbors several times, in a tone that suggested what he really meant was that she ought to be more accommodating. He said nothing that acknowledged Harlan Croft by name. Julia folded her hands in her lap. "Sheriff Beaumont," she said, in the pleasant, measured tone she reserved for situations in which she was quite angry. "Are you aware that I registered the deed to the Norris property at the Taylor County Courthouse in Abilene 4 days ago? A certified copy has been filed. I also spoke at length with a lawyer named Aldridge, who has documentation of Croft's prior inquiries regarding the legal abandonment of the property. In the event that anything else happens to my fences or my livestock or my water supply, I intend to write a letter to the county judge in Abilene, with copies to the Territorial Land Office. I want you to know that so that you can factor it into your decision about how thoroughly to investigate any future incidents." Beaumont's smile had gone somewhat fixed. "Now, Miss Norris, I appreciate your time," she said, and left. George was waiting outside with the horses. He took one look at her face as she came through the sheriff's door. "That good, was it?" he said. "He's Croft's man," she said. Might as well be. She took Dora's reins. She had started calling the gray mare Dora, which George had raised an eyebrow at and said nothing about. But he knows now that I've established a paper trail. Men like Beaumont don't lose sleep over the right thing. They lose sleep over documentation. George swung up into his saddle. You'd have made a fine lawyer yourself. Better than Aldridge, she said. He charges too much. He grinned at her, and she grinned back, and they rode out of Redemption Creek in the long afternoon light, side by side on the unpaved street, and she was aware of several people watching them from the boardwalk with expressions that ranged from curious to affronted, and she felt perfectly fine about all of it. The following weeks were a period of building, rather than simply defending. With the deed secure, Julia moved to formalize a cattle sale arrangement with a buyer in Abilene, establishing regular commerce that would make the ranch financially self-sustaining, rather than simply surviving on reserves. She hired on a second hand a young man of 20 named Teodoro, whose family had ranched in South Texas for 3 generations, to help with the expanding workload. She ordered supplies to rebuild the northern fence properly, with deeper posts and more bracing, and she and George and Teodoro spent 5 long days in the heat putting it right. Through all of this, the relationship between her and George deepened in the way of things built well steadily, with attention paid to what was needed, without dramatic lurches in either direction. He was not a man of grand gestures. He brought her coffee before she was awake in the mornings, leaving it on the porch step for her to find. He noticed when she was tired and took on the heavier evening tasks without being asked. He asked for her opinion on ranch decisions and listened with real attention when she gave it, not in the patronizing way of a man pretending to consult, but in the genuine way of a partner thinking through a problem with another mind. She gave him the same in return. She noticed when the long days wore on him, which showed not in complaint but in a certain tightening around his eyes, and on those evenings she would find some excuse to sit with him on the porch with coffee or the occasional small glass of whiskey from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes, and they would talk about nothing in particular until the tightness eased. She asked about the horses because she knew they were where his truest passion lay. He understood horses in a way that was almost a language, and when he spoke about them, his expression opened in a way she loved to see. On a Sunday in early June, when they had both taken the morning slower than usual, George caught a horse, the young one he had been lunging the day she arrived, a compact buckskin gelding, and brought him out to the open pasture and asked if she wanted to learn to train from the ground. She said yes before he finished the question. For 2 hours, under the fierce morning sun, he stood beside her and guided her hands on the lead rope and spoke quietly to her and to the horse in the same measured cadence. And she felt something shift in her understanding of him, something about patience as an act of love rather than a quality of character. Patience as the choice to give a living thing the time it needed rather than the time that was convenient. When the horse finally responded, dropping his head and softening his eye and stepping toward her with that trust that horses extend so deliberately, she let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and George said, "There," so quietly it was almost to himself, and she turned and found him watching her face rather than the horse, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before and would spend a long time afterward wanting words adequate to describe. She reached up and touched his jaw. He caught her hand and held it there. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it precisely then, but it was true in that moment in such a clean, self-evident way that it would have been strange not to. His breath went out slowly. He turned his head and pressed his mouth briefly to her palm and then looked at her with those eyes that were always so direct. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I was working up to saying it correctly." "You said it correctly," she informed him. "Did I? There is no incorrect way to say a true thing." He brought her hand down from his jaw and held it, fingers interlaced, and the buckskin gelding nosed at his shoulder with a democratic sort of interest that made them both laugh. July brought the dry season with a vengeance that year of 1878, as it so often did in West Texas, and the management of water became the ranch's primary challenge. The creek ran lower than George said he'd seen it in 3 years, and the irrigation channel to the south pasture had to be extended to reach the receding water line. The cattle needed careful rotating between pastures to manage the reduced grass. It was exhausting work under a sun that seemed determined to prove a point, and there were days when Julia went to bed so deeply tired that she was asleep before she had finished the thought of sleep. But the ranch held, the cattle held, the fences held. And on the last day of July, when the sky finally broke open in the afternoon and delivered a drenching hour of rain that soaked the cracked earth and filled the creek and turned the air to something cool and silver and miraculous, Julia stood on the porch and watched it come and felt something very close to triumph. George came to stand beside her, having run in from the barn where he had been sheltering with the horses. He was wet through and did not appear to care. He looked out at the rain hammering the pasture with the same satisfaction she felt, and then he looked at her, and she kissed him in the rain on the porch of her father's house, her hands in his wet hair and his arms around her waist, and Teodoro, coming from the bunkhouse at a run, saw them and turned around and went back inside with admirable tact. Harlan Croft made his final move in August. It came not as fence destruction or missing cattle, but as a legal document, delivered to her door by a rider from Abilene, a formal challenge to the title of the Norris property, claiming that the deed filed by Edmund Norris in 1869 had included a surveying error that misidentified the property boundaries, and that 80 of the ranch's 300 acres were, correctly surveyed, part of the Croft property. The document was dense with legal language and the signatures of a surveyor Julia did not recognize and a notary from Abilene. She sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times, and her face was very still the whole time. George read it over her shoulder. He finished, he straightened and was quiet for a moment. "It's fabricated," he said. "There was a survey done when your father filed. I saw the stakes." "I know," she said, "but proving it fabricated requires a counter-survey and a lawyer prepared to argue the point and someone willing to look closely at whether that surveyor's signature is genuine." She set the papers down. "It'll cost money and time. Do you have either?" She looked up at him. "I have enough of both and something else." "What?" "My father kept a journal," she said. "He kept it for 20 years. He recorded everything, every purchase, every boundary, every transaction. I found it in his desk when I arrived." I didn't think much of it then beyond sentiment. She pushed back from the table. He would have recorded the original survey, the date, the surveyor's name, the boundary stakes. My father was meticulous. George was very still. "Where's the journal?" She was already on her way to the study. Edmund Norris had indeed recorded the 1869 survey, the surveyor's name, his fee, a description of each boundary marker, and a hand-drawn map of the property lines with measurements noted in his careful, small handwriting. The surveyor's name was Thomas Galvey, and it was not the name on Croft's document. Julia wrote 3 letters that evening. One to Aldridge the lawyer, one to the county judge in Abilene, and one to a Texas land office official whose name she had obtained through Aldridge months ago, just in case. She enclosed copies of the relevant journal pages with each letter, sealed them, and rode into Redemption Creek in the morning to mail them herself. Aldridge wrote back within 2 weeks. He had located Thomas Galvey, who was elderly but alive and living in San Antonio, and who, when contacted by post, confirmed that he had surveyed the Norris property in 1869 and had records of his own. The surveyor whose name appeared on Croft's document was, Aldridge noted with careful legal restraint, a man who had been deceased since 1874. The signature, therefore, was either forged or attributed to a ghost, and he had communicated this to the county judge, who was taking an interest. The resolution, when it came, was not dramatic. It rarely was. Harlan Croft withdrew his legal challenge in September, when the county judge made clear that the fabrication of the survey documentation was a matter he intended to pursue with genuine seriousness, and that the withdrawal of the challenge would factor into the extent of that pursuit. Croft withdrew. The judge pursued the matter to a moderate extent anyway. There was a formal finding of attempted fraud, a fine that was significant enough to register, and a notation in the county records that provided some meaningful insurance against future attempts. Sheriff Beaumont found, shortly thereafter, that his next election was somewhat more contested than he had expected. Julia did not actively campaign against him. She would say, if asked, that she did no such thing. But she did speak frankly and honestly about her experiences with the office to various people in town over the following months, and honesty had a way of traveling. With Croft's legal attack defeated and the active interference ceased, the ranch entered a period of genuine growth. Julia hired a third hand in October, an older man named Clifford who had 15 years of cattle experience and a quiet manner that integrated well into the operation. They brought in a good fall sale, 22 head at prices Julia had negotiated herself, and the profit was enough to make improvements she had been planning since spring. A proper hay storage structure, repairs to the barn roof, new equipment for the irrigation channel. It was in October also that George asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony in the barn on a Wednesday afternoon when they were both in the middle of something else. He was treating the roan gelding's hoof, and she was reviewing a list of supply needs from Clifford, and he looked up from the horse's hoof and said, "Julia, will you marry me?" She put down Clifford's list. "In the barn," she said. "I've been thinking about where to do it for 3 weeks and I couldn't decide, so I thought I should just say it before I wasted another 3 weeks." She looked at him for a moment, this man who was unhurried in almost all things and who had apparently been tormented by the question of location to the point of abandoning the search for the right one. It was possibly the most charming thing she had ever heard. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, George." He put the horse's hoof down carefully and stood. "Obviously. I have been in love with you since July at the latest, possibly May. What did you think I was doing?" He crossed the barn to her and took her face in his hands, the ones that were always warm and slightly rough from work, and kissed her in the way she had come to think of as entirely his own, unhurried and specific and full of a seriousness that was also, impossibly, a form of joy. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I don't have a ring yet," he said. "I don't need one immediately. I'd like to get one when we're in Abilene." "Then we'll get one in Abilene," she said. She reached up and covered one of his hands with her own. "George, say yes again," he blinked. "What?" "Say you want to marry me, properly in words, because I want to hear it." He understood. He was not a man who shied from a direct thing when he understood it was needed. "I want to marry you," he said, looking at her with all of that unguarded expression she had fallen in love with. "I want to build this ranch with you and grow old on this land with you and argue about fence lines and cattle prices with you and watch you talk down every difficult man in 3 counties. A pause. "I want the house to be full." She felt the ache of it behind her breastbone, the good kind of ache that meant something true. "The house will be full," she said. "I promise you that." They were married in November of 1878. In the parlor of the Norris ranch house, which was, George now pointed out, the Maddox house too, and she told him that they could simply call it their house if he found the naming difficult. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Redemption Creek every 6 weeks, a gentle man named Collier who had a gift for keeping things honest and warm at the same time, and who married them in front of a small company of witnesses. Hector from the livery, who had started the whole chain of events by telling her about George, and whom she would always consider somewhat responsible for her happiness. Aldridge the lawyer who brought his wife, a small sharp woman who cried at the good parts, Teodoro, who dressed carefully and stood very straight, Clifford, who wore a clean shirt and looked at the proceedings with solemn approval, and one other person whom Julia had Written to in late September, George's younger brother, a 26-year-old man named Samuel who lived in New Mexico Territory and who had ridden 3 days to be there, and who shook his brother's hand afterward with an expression of such profound relief that Julia understood immediately that Samuel had worried about George for a long time and was glad to have something concrete and settled to stop worrying about. The ceremony itself was short and sufficient. They spoke their vows face to face with their hands joined, and when Collier pronounced them married, George kissed her in a way that was not quite appropriate for a parlor with company, and which she did not discourage for a single moment, and there was laughter from the small audience, and someone, almost certainly Samuel, said, "Finally," under his breath. That winter was cold by Texas standards, which was not the cold of Missouri winters Julia had known, but a different kind, sharp and dry and clear, with nights that dropped below freezing and mornings that turned the creek's shallow edges to lace-thin ice. They spent it well. There was a quality to the evenings of that first winter together, she and George at the kitchen table by lamplight, he working on tack or going over records or reading from one of the handful of books he owned, she writing letters or planning the spring schedule that she would remember for the rest of her life as the texture of contentment, not excitement, not novelty, the quieter and more durable thing beneath them. She told him in January that she was pregnant. She had suspected since December and had kept it to herself for 3 weeks while she was certain, and she told him at breakfast on a cold Thursday morning, plainly and directly, because there was no other way she told him anything. The expression on his face was the third one she had catalogued alongside the too wide smile and the unguarded look. It was something that lived entirely in his eyes before it reached anything else, something that could only be described as the arrival of something that had been hoped for longer than he had known. He put down his coffee cup. He stood up from the table. He came around to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her and took both her hands and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Say something," she said. "I'm getting there," he said. Then, "Are you well? How are you feeling? Are you—" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I am healthy and strong, and the only thing that has been different is that I have not been able to tolerate the smell of coffee for the past 2 weeks, which has been genuinely inconvenient given how much we drink." He laughed, that real low sound, and pressed his forehead to their joined hands for a moment in a gesture that was so entirely unperformed that her heart did something complicated in her chest. When he looked up, his eyes were bright again. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "Our baby. Unless you know something I don't." He laughed again and stood and gathered her up out of the chair in a way that required some coordination given that he was a tall man, and the kitchen was not large, and he held her for a long time in the lamplight of the cold January morning, and she felt his heartbeat under her ear, steady and certain, and thought that this was precisely what she had come west for, even though she had not known it when she left. Spring came again, the second one for Julia on the Norris land, and it was different from the first. The ranch was stable now, genuinely and measurably so. The cattle herd had grown. The land was producing. The irrigation system worked. Croft had been quiet since September, had in fact pulled his operation back and hired a new foreman and kept his fence lines precisely where they belonged. Beaumont was still sheriff but operated with a noticeably different bearing around Julia, something chastened and careful that she did not take pleasure in but did find practically useful. George had, over the winter, broken 4 new horses using a method of patient groundwork that consistently produced exceptional animals, and word had gotten out. A rancher from 30 miles south came to inquire in February, and another in March, and by April George had a waiting list for horse training that would keep him profitably occupied for the year, and which Julia regarded with proprietary pride on his behalf. The baby was born in August of 1879, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Hartley, who had set up practice in Redemption Creek 6 months prior to some initial skepticism and rapid universal acceptance, because people needed a doctor, and she was clearly very good at it. The birth was hard in the way that births were, long and demanding, and George spent 7 hours in the adjacent room doing absolutely nothing useful except being present. And later he would tell Samuel in a letter that he had never in his life felt so helpless or so certain that he was in exactly the right place. The baby was a boy. Julia named him Edmund George Maddox, for her father and his father both, and she told George this decision lying in the bed afterward, exhausted and certain, and holding the baby, who was red-faced and indignant and remarkably loud for a person who had been in the world for under 2 hours. George sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the same unguarded expression he had turned on Julia in the pasture when she first reached her hand toward the horse, and he said, "Edmund George," like he was memorizing the sound of it, and then he said, "Hello," to the baby in a voice Julia had never heard him use before, the voice you saved for a thing so small and knew that ordinary speech seemed too large for it. She watched them, the big, weathered man and the tiny red-faced boy, and felt something complete itself. Some circle she had not known was closing quietly and without fuss in the way of things that were meant to be. Edmund proved to be a child of strong opinions from the earliest possible age, which George said was entirely to be expected, and which Julia said she had no idea what he meant by. By the time the boy was 3, he followed George around the property with a seriousness of purpose that made Teodoro and Clifford both smile throughout the day, mimicking his father's gestures with tools and watching the horses with those green eyes he had inherited from his mother. He said the word horse before he said most other words, which George took as a personal achievement. In the summer of 1881, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. She told George at the kitchen table in the same direct manner as before, and he responded with the same brightness in his eyes, though this time he also glanced at Edmund, who was sitting on the floor nearby looking at a picture book with the concentration of a judge, and then back at Julia, and smiled. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1882, and Julia named her Clara, after a sister she had lost in childhood, and held her in the lamplight with a tenderness that George watched from the doorway for a long time before entering. Clara had her father's dark hair and his tendency to stillness, and she and Edmund, after an initial period of mutual suspicion, developed the close and complicated alliance of siblings who are deeply different from each other and consequently understand each other very well. Redemption Creek changed over those years in the way of frontier towns in the late 19th century, growing in some ways and staying stubbornly the same in others. The railroad extended a spur line through in 1882 that brought commerce and noise and new faces and new complications. And the town that had regarded Julia Norris with raised eyebrows in the spring of 1878 was now a town that regarded Julia Maddox as one of its most consequential residents. A woman who sat on the town council, she had pushed for the seat in 1880 and gotten it by a margin that surprised people who had not been paying attention to how many of their neighbors she had helped since arriving, who had opinions about the school, about the water rights, about the treatment of the Mexican and black families who formed a significant part of the community and were not always treated as the equals they plainly were. On that last matter she was more than vocal. She was effective, which was the more important thing. She had grown up in a world that made very little logical sense on the matter of how some people were treated, and she saw the same illogic operating in Redemption Creek, and she was constitutionally incapable of not saying so. George supported her in this the way he supported her in everything, not passively, not by standing back, but by standing beside her when the moments required it, and by speaking plainly himself when the opportunity arose. He was respected in the way that quiet, competent men were respected in small Western towns, and he used that respect deliberately and without shame on behalf of the things they both believed. Samuel came to visit from New Mexico in the fall of 1882, intending to stay a week, and stayed 3 months. He was a likable man, more talkative than his brother but with the same fundamental honesty, and he fell in with the rhythms of the ranch with an ease that suggested he might be persuaded to stay longer than any particular visit. Edmund adored him. Clara regarded him with the assessing look of a baby who was not easily impressed, and then, having assessed, accepted him with what appeared to be the magnanimous judgment that he passed. One evening near the end of Samuel's extended stay, Julia noticed him watching Dr. Hartley, who had come out to the ranch to check on Clara, who had had a brief fever with an expression Julia recognized. She said nothing to him. She did mention it to George later in the dark of their room after the children were asleep, and George was quiet for a moment and then said he mentioned her. Once, after the 3rd week, he paused. He's shy. She is not, Julia said. No, she is not. She smiled at the ceiling. He should stay in Redemption Creek, she said. He's got a life in New Mexico. He has a job in New Mexico. That's different from a life. George was quiet again in the thoughtful way. You think so? I know so, she said, because you had a job when I arrived and look what happened. He laughed softly in the dark, and she felt the movement of it through the bed, and she thought, as she often thought in those quiet nighttime hours, that she was a woman who had been, by any honest accounting, extremely fortunate. Not because life had been easy, it had not been particularly, but because she had arrived in the right place at the right time and been brave enough to stay, and in staying had found a partner in every true sense of the word, and a home that was hers in a way that went far deeper than the deed she kept in the lockbox in the study. Samuel Maddox did not immediately pursue Dr. Hartley, because he was indeed shy and she was indeed not, and the resulting comedy of someone being very obvious and someone else refusing to notice played out over the winter months in a way that amused everyone. It resolved, eventually, in the way of such things. An evening in January when Hartley, who was plainly not a woman given to waiting indefinitely for what she wanted, simply told him what she thought of him, and Samuel, having been given the opening he had been working toward for months, took it. They were married in the spring of 1883, and Samuel made the practical arrangement of moving to Redemption Creek entirely, finding work as a farrier, whose skill complemented George's horse training operation in a way that benefited both of them professionally, and gave the brothers occasion to work together daily, which pleased them both in the quiet way of men who had grown up without enough family and were grateful for what they now had. The Maddox Ranch. They had officially renamed it in 1880, a decision Julia made matter-of-factly and without sentiment over the naming convention, saying only that it should be the name of the people who were building it now grew through the first half of the 1880s, into something she had not entirely dared to plan for in the beginning but had perhaps hoped for, in the optimistic way she brought to things. 400 acres by 1883, when they purchased 50 adjoining acres from a homesteader who was moving north. 500 the year after that. The cattle operation was substantial and well managed, and George had built a reputation for horses that extended well beyond Redemption Creek, with buyers coming from as far as Fort Worth and San Antonio to work with him directly. Edmund turned 6 in 1885 and went to the school in town with a seriousness about reading that surprised everyone slightly, given that he spent all available time outdoors. He was, his teacher reported, a child who did things completely. He would either be entirely absorbed in a book or entirely absorbed in a horse, with no visible midpoint. Julia heard this and recognized her son with a complicated fondness. Clara at 4 was a different thing, entirely quieter than Edmund, more watchful, with a gift for drawing that she exercised on every available surface including, memorably, the barn wall which George discovered, and which he did not make her erase because the drawing was, he admitted to Julia later, actually quite good. She drew horses with a particular accuracy that he found impressive in a person who was not yet 5 years old. The house was full. It was full in the way George had said he wanted, in the cold firelight of that November night before they were married, when he had been more unguarded than usual, full of noise and needs, and the specific chaos of children, and the warm, constant presence of people who chose to be there. Julia stood sometimes in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was awake, with her coffee. She had made herself develop the taste for it, finding it practical, and listened to the silence before the house woke up in thought, with a fullness in her chest that was something like gratitude elevated to a kind of reverence, that this was what it looked like to build something real. She thought about her father, too, in those quiet moments. She thought about the letter he had sent her, the one she had read 100 times after his death, in which he had said that the land was hers if she wanted it, and that he hoped she would come because the country was hard and beautiful, and it suited her, which was the closest he had ever come to saying that he understood her. And she had cried when she first read it and had not cried about it since, because the tears had resolved into something else. Some peace about the fact that he had known and had said it in the only way available to him. She thought he would have liked George. She was quite certain of it. She thought he would have watched his grandson following George around the property and his granddaughter drawing horses on the barn wall, and he would have said very little about any of it, but that his silence would have been the satisfied kind. On the evening of their 7th anniversary in November of 1885, after the children were in bed and Clifford and Teodoro had long since returned to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, George came in from the barn smelling of hay and horses, the way she had long since stopped noticing, because it was simply the smell of him, and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine. They had been keeping for the occasion. Wine was still something of an occasion in Redemption Creek rather than a commonplace, and he washed his hands and sat across from her and accepted the glass she poured. They sat for a while without speaking, in the way they did that never felt like silence so much as a shared presence. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. She looked at him across the table. He was more weathered than the man who had lunged that buckskin gelding in the spring light of 1878, with lines beside his eyes and a gray thread or two at his temples, and she thought he was the handsomest person she had ever known, and that the handsomeness was not a feature of his face, but of what lived in it, the steadiness, the humor that showed up quietly and unexpectedly, the way he was fully present in whatever he turned his attention to. He was looking at her the same way, she realized, with that full attention, with that openness that was still 7 years in somehow a gift every time she received it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He tilted his head. "That you are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said, "and that I am aware of how fortunate I am. Every day I want you to know that." She felt the warmth of it, uncomplicated and clean. "I know," she said. "I also want you to know the same, that I'm remarkable." "That I am aware how fortunate I am," she said, smiling, "and that you are, yes, remarkable considerably." He smiled, the too wide one she had first seen on that thundery April evening, and which remained, after 7 years, her favorite sight. He reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and he held it the way he always had, with that specific deliberate certainty, and they finished their wine in the lamplight with the Texas night settled around the house, and the children sleeping, and the horses quiet in the barn, and the land they had built together lying dark and steady under the November stars. She was 31 years old and George was 37, and they had built something that would outlast them both, not just in land and livestock, but in the particular character of what they had made together, a marriage of genuine equals, a household built on honesty and shared labor, and the daily choice to love each other actively rather than passively, a ranch that would pass to Edmund and Clara, and whoever they became and whatever they built afterward. The years would bring more, of course. There would be good years and difficult years, because that was the nature of ranching and of life in the West and of life anywhere, if one was honest about it. There would be drought years and years of plenty, years when the cattle market was favorable, and years when it was not, years when the children were uncomplicated, and years when they were very firmly themselves in ways that required creative parental management. Samuel and his wife would have children of their own, a daughter in 1884 and twin boys in 1886, which made the extended family considerably noisier. And the Maddox household and the nearby Maddox household would be intertwined in the way of people who chose family as deliberately as they had found it. And there would be evenings like this one, many, many evenings like this one, with the lamplight warm on the walls of the cedar house, and the coffee on the stove, and the man across the table who had stayed, because it seemed wrong to let things fall apart, and who had looked at her that first day with no agenda and no performance, only assessment and then straightforward respect, and who had grown into the kind of love that did not make demands but simply was continuous and sustaining. The way the creek was, or the way the wide Texas sky was, something so much larger than any single moment that it could hold all the moments inside it and still not be full. Julia Maddox set down her wine glass and looked at her husband in the lamplight and thought, as she had thought before and would think again, that she had been exactly right on the night she arrived in this country, when the red dust swirled around her skirts and the town turned to look at her with skepticism, and she had squared her jaw and walked into it anyway. She had been right to walk into it. She had been right about all of it. "Come on," she said, rising from the table. "It's late." George finished his wine and stood, and he put out the lamp on the table the way he always did, the last lamp left burning in the house, with a care that she had come to understand as his way of closing a day properly, attending to its final moment with the same deliberateness he brought to its first. He checked the door. He followed her down the hall in the dark that was not truly dark because the moon was up and the Texas sky never entirely let go of its light. And outside, on the 300 acres, on the 400 acres, on the 500, the land lay quiet and certain under that enormous sky, and the cattle moved slowly in the far pasture, and the horses stood together near the fence in the way horses did, their warm breath making small clouds in the cool November air, and the creek ran low and silver through the cottonwoods, and the whole of it, every inch of it, was theirs. Not Croft's, not Beaumont's, not anyone's who had tried to take it or diminish it or reduce the woman who came to claim it to something smaller than she was. Theirs. Built by their hands and their choices and their particular, unlikely, necessary love for each other, built to last, and lasting. The creek ran on through the dark. The stars wheeled overhead. And inside the cedar house the lamps went out one by one until the house was dark and warm and full and still, and the night held everything in it gently and without apology, the way the West always had, brutal and beautiful and indifferent and magnificent, asking only that you be equal to it, asking only that you stay. They had stayed. They would stay. They were home.